Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we meet here today and pay respect to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And we recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So it's a real pleasure for me today to introduce to you the first of our Director's Choice speakers for this year. And today's speaker is Professor Ginny Barbour from QUT, where she is the, get your title right, Ginny, the, and I've lost it, co-lead for the Office of Scholarly Communication at QUT. So just to give you a little bit of background, what we want to do in these Director's Choice lectures this year is to highlight some areas of general interest that we think really ought to be in the minds of everybody at TRI thinking about our research. And one of the areas that myself and Professor Patsy Yates wanted to highlight was about open access publishing. And of course, we realized that we have an absolute expert here in Brisbane in Ginny Barbour, and that's why we invited her to come and talk today. So Ginny, as I say, is the co-lead for the Office of Scholarly Communication at QUT, and she's Director of Open Access Australasia. Now, Ginny trained in medicine in the UK, and she specialized in hematology, and then she did a DPhil at Oxford and postdoctoral research in the US on globin gene regulation. So she understands science and she understands medicine. Ginny was one of the 3 founding editors of PLOS Medicine, and she's been involved in many international open access, innovative scholarly communication and publication and research integrity initiatives. Amongst many of her other activities, she's the chair of the Committee on Publication Ethics and Vice Chair of Declaration on Research Assessment Steering Committee. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Ginny to give her lecture today. Ginny.
Great, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Indigenous owners of the land that we now work on. It's a great privilege to be at QUT and to be in an institution in particular that I think that has taken great steps forward in acknowledging Indigenous contributions to the research and work that we do. So yes, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour through open access and open science, which is kind of one of my passions. And I'm going to hopefully inspire you and make you feel like you want to get engaged with it. I'm not going to answer every question about open access because it's a bit of a huge topic, but I'm more than happy to talk to anyone afterwards. So my title is Open Access and Open Science, an Overnight Sensation, 20 years in the making. It's kind of like all good stories. Everybody thinks that things happen overnight, but in fact, there's been a huge amount of work going on for more than 20 years. And I'm going to sort of talk about 2 aspects of it, the open access and the open science, explain why they're different, and also kind of come up with some ideas about how we might go forward and the things that you need to care about. So the slides, you're welcome to have my slides afterwards, so please don't get blown away by the insane number of graphics on them. So let's just quickly talk. First of all, I'm going to come back to this image in a minute. The first thing to say is open access is not new. Actually, QUT was at the very beginning of open access in Australia. Actually, the first ANU had the first repository back in 2000, but QUT had the world's first open access policy for research. So the world's first. It was a huge leader in this area and has continued to be an innovator for many years. There have been a huge number of global, international, and regional initiatives, and I will come back to this slide right at the end. But the thing is, we're here in 2022 and open access is still not the majority of research content. In fact, just yesterday, a colleague of mine who works in government wrote to me and said, actually, I need this paper and I can't get access to it. Works in the federal government and can't get access to it. It's kind of insane, isn't it? So the thing is, there have been a huge number of things that have happened. So I hope, put up your hand, everybody who's got an orchid in this room. If you haven't got one, you can get one in about 2 minutes whilst I'm talking. So please get an ORCID. That's been an incredibly important part of the infrastructure of open science. DOIs, everyone know what a DOI is? Digital object, so it's basically an ORCID for articles. So it's essentially a unique identifier. These are really important pieces of infrastructure. Creative Commons licenses, is that a familiar term for people? Bit of nodding, bit of shaking, really important. Repository infrastructure, who's put a paper in their repository? Who doesn't know where the repository is? Come talk to me afterwards. Huge number of diverse open access journals and books, and there's some real interesting innovation going on about new models, preprints and overlay models. So all of this was happening in the background in the past 20 years. There have also been huge international policy initiatives. So I don't know why every open access initiative seems to begin with B, but anyway, Budapest, Bethesda and Berlin. The Budapest open access one is probably the most important one, and that was where open access was originally defined. And again, Tom Cochrane, who was at QUT at that time, was one of the original signatories to that, so really important right there at the beginning. Open Access 2020 was an important initiative. The idea being we'll have full open access by 2020. Didn't quite make that, but there's still some really critical things happening. Plan S from Coalition S. Who's heard of Coalition S or Plan S? Bit of nodding. So Plan S, nobody actually knows what the S stands for. We think there's kind of a bit of a joke. It might be they went from A to S and eventually ended up with a plan when they got that far through the alphabet. But the original person who wrote it said it's about shocking things, and it has made a profound difference in how we think about openness across a world. But it's an initiative of policymakers primarily from Europe. And then back here in Australia, both the NHMRC have actually had policies since 2013. So these are the kind of things that would have been important to you when you've been submitting your research. But the thing that really made an inflection point was this, and I don't have to kind of introduce what it is, but it made a huge change in how we thought about open access on a global level. And, you know, I wouldn't wish a pandemic on us ever again, but it did make us think pretty substantially about the importance of openness. So what kind of things happened? Well, the first thing is that we needed access to all research. So we needed to know about the new coronaviruses. We needed to think about the old coronaviruses. That was kind of important. The obvious kind of things like, you know, how do you build a ventilator? There was some really interesting stuff right at the beginning. You remember about when they were trying to make ventilator parts. How do face masks work? That kind of stuff became very important. What about disinfectants, all that kind of thing. But then, you know, kind of some of the weirder types of research were things like, you know, how do you control aerosol spread on a cruise ship? Remember that, you know, when we were trying to figure out how to stop that. Developing drive-through pharmacies was one of my favorite papers. And then things like how do you support athletes and other people in lockdown? So we had a whole need for massive information, and it all needed to be open. It needed to be open immediately. And so this is really what happens. So just to show you, this is from a paper called Preprinting the Pandemic. It's actually a preprint, which is kind of nice. And it starts in January here before the pandemic and goes up to November. And what you can see is that there was a huge number of papers that began to be published back in early April. The pandemic was declared around here. These are the journal articles, and these are the preprints. And this is really dramatically different from what we would expect from the normal course of research. And in this bottom part here, what you can see is these are all the types of preprints. So not only was there a huge diversity of a different type of publishing, so going from publishing journal articles, but also they were published everywhere. But the main one, I have to say, was medRxiv. And I will just say one of the things that I'm involved with is medRxiv. I'm part of the group that does screening for them. So I have a great interest in it succeeding. medRxiv, as you may know, got set up about 8 months, I think so, before the pandemic started. They had a kind of sweet idea that it was going to sort of, you know, take off gradually. But this is kind of what happened. And so they had a rather rapid need for people to be able to screen papers. And this is from very early on. So this is 2020. And what you could see, this is the cumulative number of papers. And at the kind of height of it, which I would say is probably mid to late April, we were getting hundreds of papers a week. And sometimes we were getting thousands of papers a week. But just look at the usage down here. There's absolutely enormous usage. So 10.95 million abstract views in April. 5.2 PDF downloads. This is enormously important. And it's continued. So medRxiv and bioRxiv have continued to be really important places for COVID-19 articles. Just this month, there's 23,000 articles in there. So it kind of changed the whole structure of publishing almost overnight in a way that I think many open access people had hoped for. But this is actually what drove it. So what else happened? There are lots of things happened with repositories. So Zenodo, which is a repository which is led by CERN, developed a whole sort of set of COVID-19 related communities where you could upload your research and collaborate with your colleagues. There was a lot of work done nationally. So this is a piece of work from the Australian Academy of Science. They collaborated with a number of groups, including the Chief Scientist's Office and various government departments to develop national resources. And probably the most important one internationally was this thing called the COVID-19 Open Research Dataset. Has anyone used that out of interest? So it's actually just finished its last, I believe it's actually decided right now that it's going to archive itself. But at the moment it has 370,000 full text research papers in, and then over 1 million papers indexed. And this was pulled together incredibly quickly at the request at that time of the White House, which was Donald Trump's White House, but in collaboration with a whole group of institutions and organizations internationally. And what they did was to call on publishers to make their research open. So these are the kind of things that happened as a result of that. They not only was this database built itself, but actually what they were able to do was to build a whole set of things based on it. So they included things like historical coronavirus research, and one in particular which looked at how this is called SciSite, which is how you investigate they managed to investigate how papers were related. And the critical thing that happened was that there was an international call for all this research to be made open and for publishers to essentially support it. I'll come back to that in a minute. So what did COVID-19 do in my view? So it made the case for immediate, free, permanent access to research papers with reuse rights, with papers that were interoperable, that were able to support ongoing seamless collaboration. So what do you need to do for that? And I'll come back to this in a little bit, but I'll just start here. So first off, you need the DOIs. You've got to be able to find the papers. Okay, that's really critical. And I will just say there was some preprint servers that went up where people said, well, they're not kind of that interesting, so we won't put a DOI on them, which means they're essentially invisible. Those papers will just disappear. You can link them to the researchers, so you had the ORCID ID. They were in a series of repositories. So this is the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, which supported a whole load of this work. And the Directory of Open Access Journals, they were also in open journals, but they were also in a whole load of other journals, and I'll come back to that. They were in a format they could be reused. They were linked to the data. So Scholix is a process for linking research papers to their data. And Crossref is a way of, is part of the underlying system processes for linking to the citations. And they all had clear reuse rights, so Creative Commons license associated with it. So all of these things are really important. Now, as researchers, you don't need to care about a lot of these things. Some of them you do need to care about. But what the key was that we needed an infrastructure that was able to support the seamless sharing of information. And part of this was the work that had been done pre the pandemic, but the case was absolutely made during the pandemic. But the problem was, even though the publishers have been asked to make their research immediately available, and of course all the open access publishers, so publishers like PLOS, Biomed Central, a whole bunch of other publishers said, absolutely, we'll share this research with the appropriate reuse rights. Quite a few of the publishers, such as some of the very big ones, said, well, kind of okay, but you can have this for as long as we think the pandemic's going to go on. So just so you know, the Elsevier has been deciding when the pandemic's been ending every so often. I think it was going to end sort of middle of last year. Then I think it was sort of February this year. Well, hasn't exactly finished. So they defined the end of the pandemic as long as the Elsevier COVID-19 Resource Centre remains active, which I think has been turned off. So just so you know, the pandemic's over, according to the publishers, which is kind of ridiculous. And they actually put different licenses on. So that's really problematic. So once you start to use different licenses, things become not really reusable. And unfortunately, because the only way that they could get publishers to buy into this was to agree to their terms, you'll see that the license for some of these articles that deposited PMC is PubMed Central, which is a big US initiative, is at the discretion of individual publishers. And even despite this, some publishers did not buy into it. So at the time of our greatest need, a whole bunch of publishers still said, yeah, no, thanks very much, we're not buying into that, which is pretty astonishing, actually. And what happened even after that, which is kind of even worse, is a whole bunch of papers that were made available during the pandemic are now back behind a paywall. So Science Direct, which is the Elsevier platform. This is Elizabeth Bick, who does a whole load of work on research integrity. And she was trying to screen these papers to see whether there were any issues with the underlying analyses. And she couldn't get them because they're all now behind a paywall. And this was earlier this year. So we're now back, unfortunately, to some extent where we were before the pandemic. And we've kind of been here before. So back in 2014, there was a huge Ebola outbreak, which you might remember. The Lancet, which is owned by Elsevier, in case people don't know that, decided they'd make a whole load of work open. But then in 2020, it's not there anymore. So there's real problems when you put the hands of put research into the hands only of publishers, because they can choose to do with it what they like. So where we are now, this is a slide from UNESCO that I just took a screenshot of last week at a talk that they gave. 70% of all scientific publications still are behind paywalls. So that means that they might be in a repository that you can get, but they certainly are not in an open journal. But for COVID, actually 85% is open, freely available. So we did okay. But my prediction would be, if we look at this in about a year's time, we'll see that quite a lot of these papers have gone back behind paywalls, and that's a real problem. So where are we now? A whole load of things happened in 2021 that are pretty exciting. So the first is that the NHMRC is consulting on a change to its open access policy. So I'm guessing quite a lot of you will be funded by the NHMRC and be required to be part of their initiatives. So they have a policy where you have to make your research open within 12 months of publication. I'll come back to what they're thinking about there. Chief Scientist, Dr. Kathy Foley, is looking at open access. Some other things that I won't particularly talk about, but I'll just highlight here. So the Australian Academy of Sciences has been a real leader in this area and released a position paper on open science last year, which states that it has a great interest in taking this forward. Open Access Australasia, the group that I work for, we increased our policy and advocacy work. And one of the things that also happened that may well directly affect you is the Council of Australian University Librarians really ramped up its negotiation on read and publish open access deals. So is anyone familiar with these read and publish deals? Has anyone published with them? Looking blank. Okay, well, the great thing about these is they have provided a route for open access for a large number of journals that are currently subscription journals. The cost of being open is bundled at the moment into the costs that the institutions pay overall. So as a researcher, you don't have to pay for them directly. And we're in the process of analysing these and seeing if they're useful. So if you are thinking of publishing in any of your favourite journals, take a look at your institution's website. QUT has a website for this, as does UQ, and you'll be able to see whether or not you have an option to publish openly. And we're experimenting with that this year. So just to go back to the NHMRC, what the NHMRC is thinking of doing is taking itself towards what is closer to what Coalition S is currently doing in the rest of the world. So the idea will be that research will be made immediately available upon publication without any embargo periods. So from the date of first time published online, the research will have to be open. And it'll have to have one of these Creative Commons licenses. So you remember I said how important that was. The importance of a Creative Commons license is it ensures that you have the reuse rights for the paper in perpetuity. And authors will retain their rights. So that means that you don't hand over your copyright to publishers. I'll come on to that again in a minute, but these are the key components of really making sure that research is fully openly available in perpetuity. So that's one side of things. And then the chief scientist, Dr. Kathy Foley, who took up her role at the beginning of 2021, signaled very early on that she was interested in an open access approach nationally. Why is that important? Well, the first thing is that if you try to negotiate with publishers on an individual level, it becomes very messy very quickly. So quite a lot of countries have done that, but the countries that have had the most success are the ones such as Sweden and France and the Netherlands who've taken a national approach to it. So Dr. Foley wants to take a national approach to it, which will allow us, for example, the intention is to negotiate on a national level with publishers. Now, she's still in the process of consulting on this. We don't know exactly what this will look like, but the aim is to take away the need for researchers to be the people who have to negotiate with publishers or pay publishers, and that it becomes part of the infrastructure overall. So watch this space, because we're hoping that consultation will come out fairly shortly. And then some international things to talk about. So I mentioned Plan S at the beginning. So this has been a policy that had been a few years in the making, but it actually became active in January 2021. And this is the idea that all research published by Coalition S will have to be made immediately available from the beginning of January 2021. Really interestingly, a whole bunch of political groups began to weigh in on this. The G7 released a research compact in January 2020, and they said they wanted to promote open science. That was kind of a bit of a surprise to quite a lot of us. Somebody obviously got it onto their agenda, but that shows that the governments in this area are now thinking about it. And then there's a couple of things from the UN, and I'm going to focus on the UNESCO one because I think that's actually probably the most exciting thing that happened. What I want to do before I quickly do that is just go back to what the difference between open access and open science is. So I talked about the idea that open access is more than free access. It has the reuse rights, it has retention of copyright, and the author attribution rights. These are really critical because we know that open access on its own is important, and it's much more important than just free access. So if you're trying to access a paper on the web and you just find something that's free, we know that that will not, as I've said earlier, will not be available in perpetuity. So these are the components of open access. The components of open science are much more broad. So this again is a slide from UNESCO. We have open access to journal publications. So this is this part here, but it also includes open research data, open educational resources, and it also includes things such as the dialogue with Indigenous research, citizen science, open science infrastructures, and engagement of social actors. So UNESCO took a very wide view in this. And the reason why I think this has been a real game changer is because it will require countries and institutions to sort of engage with it. And I think it will will allow us to have a much broader framework. And I'm hoping that Australia will take some part in this. I'll quickly take you through how this actually happened, which was pretty interesting, and it's important because it showed the buy-in that happened. So this is the recommendation in its sort of kind of at a very high level. They wanted to provide an international framework for open science. The reason that they did this, and it actually started before the pandemic, was because as I showed you on the arrow right at the very beginning, we know that there's been a lot of local work on open access, been a lot of local work in various countries, but there's been no overall attempt to bring it together. And UNESCO decided that they had the responsibility to do this. And the key one is they outlined a common definition, shared values, principles, and standards. And they wanted to not only outline it, but they wanted to have a way to implement it, and they wanted to have a way to monitor it. It's a great website if you're interested in this. And it began in 2019, so it began pre-pandemic, but it continued during the pandemic. And the things that happened, what was really critical about it was it brought a whole group of people together globally to agree on it. And I've not been part of international decision-making before. I was involved somewhat with this particular meeting, and it highlighted to me the importance of getting a consensus to get everyone to buy in. So Australia was involved in reviewing the draft, providing feedback, and I was part of a particular meeting along with Sarah Brown, who was from the Department of Industry, Science and Energy, and the UNESCO representative from Australia. We had a huge, long Zoom. If you think Zoom meetings have been bad, I've got to tell you about this one. It actually went on for 5 days, for 8 hours. This was kind of the agenda. Don't ever be taken in by short agendas, because this was the most horrendous agenda. We had a debate on it about whether it was a good idea, which included at that time quite a lot of input from the Russians and the Cubans and a whole bunch of others who decided to just have some general posturing. We reviewed literally every line in the recommendation. Fortunately, it's not a hugely long recommendation, but it was still pretty long. And then we did it again. And we did that over 5 days. In 2 languages, 6 simultaneous translations. And the woman who chaired it, who I just think could clearly run the world, was absolutely magnificent in bringing this thing together. But we got there. This is the chair, and we actually managed in the course of those 5 days to agree the final text of this recommendation. And it was actually quite a profound moment. At the end of it, some of the people in the room were really quite emotional, because this was the fruition for many people of more than 20 years of work to try and get open science onto the international stage, and they did it. And they said, the rapporteur said, we've made history today, and I actually think we did. The next thing that happened after that was it was actually adopted by the member states in November 2021. So Australia is a signatory to UNESCO, so that means that we're part of that. The key things that they did was they said, this isn't just about specific topics. This is it's a value-based and a principle-based recommendation. And some of the things that particularly have come to be very important as we transition into a more open access world is the concept of equity. So sometimes when we talk about open access, equity is thought of in equity of access to read research. But we have a real problem, and we were talking about it just before we started, which is that, if you have to pay $20,000 to publish a research paper, then you're going to lock out a whole bunch of people from being able to publish. So we'll go from lack of access to read to lack of access to publish, and that's highly problematic. So one of the key parts of this recommendation is that equity and fairness needs to be built into it. And why UNESCO, I think, is really important is because it has good representation, global representation, not just from very well-resourced countries. And these are the 7 objectives of it. I won't go through them, but one of them is around a common understanding of open science, which I think is really important. Another one is around investing in the infrastructure and services to make this happen, changing the culture towards open science, and thinking about innovative approaches. So it means that we just need to think differently about how we publish research and how we do research. It's not just about the same journals and the same process that we had before. And one particular part that actually we were asked to make sure was properly represented within this was Indigenous knowledge within the recommendation. And this is the text that was included within that. So I think that's really important, because it means that we're not going to just have research that is based on, again, not going to have open science which works for traditional research, but will work for research more globally. So what does this matter to all of you? So I'm going to just, I'll talk about where this all fits. So I've said that open access is more than open science. This is the open access ecosystem to some extent. So we have open access to research papers. We've got the open data, which I haven't really touched on very much, but is very important. And I suspect that many of you, when you submit to journals now, will be being asked to make your research data open or available. And that's a really important part of it. Open source code and software and other methods are becoming increasingly important. We also know that things such as open peer review are becoming more important. Who's done an open peer review here, just out of interest? Good experience, not good experience? Not sure. It's whatever happens, it's changing, and I think that's something we're going to see more of. And then we're also need to think more about open educational resources. Has anyone published an open textbook here? Great. And that's something that we're going to be seeing more of. So the open ecosystem is not just possible, but it's actually expected across the research life cycle. And the opportunities, I think, are for us to sort of embed it in our daily practices. The key thing that, again, I often hear when people talk about open research is they say, well, it just works for one part of research. It works for biomedical sciences, or works for the hard sciences, or it works for, one particular specialty, doesn't work, for example, for humanities. What we are beginning to see, and that was really reflected within the open science recommendation, is that you need to have openness that works appropriately for your discipline. And that is very much embedded within the processes that are being developed. So when I talk to researchers about how they can make their work open, I thought it'd be worth just highlighting a few things. So the first thing that you can do is to make sure that you share your data. We know that there's an increasing expectation to make your research data open. That doesn't necessarily, or to share your data, that doesn't mean necessarily that you make it fully open. So Obviously, if you've got sensitive data, you've got data that includes patient identifiable information, you're not going to be able to fully make it open, but you can make it in a form that's known as FAIR, which means findable, interoperable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And it means that somebody else can use it if they need to. So think about how you are able to share your data at the very beginning. Second thing you can do is post a preprint. So posting a preprint now, one of the things that we thought would happen post-pandemic was that the number of submissions to preprint servers would drop off. Actually, they have with regard to COVID, but we're now seeing people posting preprints from specialties that never posted them in the past. So that's really interesting. So two things that are really good about that. First off is you can actually ensure you can claim credit for your research early on, so you're not going to get scooped. So a preprint is a great way of doing that. And secondly, we know that for researchers, posting a preprint actually increases the visibility of your research and makes, for what it's worth, increases the citation of the final published paper because of the visibility associated with it. So it's a very good thing to think about, whatever your discipline. The third bit is about publishing in an OA journal or depositing in an open repository. So open access journals, there's a huge number of them. We did talk a little bit about them earlier, about there's a confusing number of colors associated with open access, which I can come back to in the questions if you like. But the key one is that wherever you publish in a journal, wherever you publish, there should be an option to make it open. That's either through the journal itself or through posting what's called the author accepted manuscript in your institutional repository. So you can make sure that the final version is fully open. I would say think about open peer review. One of the advantages of open peer review, again, is it allows you to get credit for the research that for the work that you're doing. And one of the real leaders in this actually has been F1000 Research, which is a really interesting platform, which has now been adopted by some key funders globally. So the Wellcome Trust, the Gates Foundation, and the European Research Council have developed their own research platforms, which allow you to publish your research immediately. There's open peer review on it, and then you can have subsequent revisions. So it's a really interesting model that combines openness, open access to the research itself with open peer review. And then the final thing you can do is make a textbook open, and quite a lot of institutions are experimenting with that. QUT and I believe UQ are supporting an initiative called Pressbooks, which is a platform that allows you to publish an open textbook. Underpinning all of these, the two things that I would say that you need to be thinking about, whatever you're doing, whatever research you're doing. Retain your rights, so make sure that you're not passing over copyright to the publisher, and then use an open license. And this is an example of a Creative Commons license, which allows you, and it ensures you get attributed whatever you do. So what about institutions? So there's a whole discussion happening now about the need for institutions to think about open science and open access more generally. The main one is actually the research culture, to be honest. If we know that if institutions don't think about and embed openness within their culture generally, it just doesn't happen. That can include things like making sure they've got policies in place to support open research, includes practical support for publication and data repositories, actually putting the money into it, making sure that it's fully staffed, having an investment in journals. So QUT for example, has a set of 5 open access journals that it supports, open educational strategies, supporting open textbooks. And then this last one, which I think is absolutely critical, is the need to reward and recognize open science. So making sure that if people share data, if they are involved in open peer review, that can be part of whatever reward and recognition that you have at an institution. This is it kind of summarized in this slide, which is something, a blog that we wrote at DORA back in 2020, when we were asked to think about the intersection between research assessment, open scholarship, and equity and inclusion. Right back here is the research culture that everybody needs to think about. And we know they're actually really key, really kind of intertwined. One of the things that I think is most interesting with open scholarship is it has allowed people who perhaps traditionally haven't had a voice within research to have more of a voice. It allows you to be more open and to be more visible, but we know that's also quite challenging. For example, a lot of people tell me, well, I'd like to make my research open, I'd like to make my data open, but I don't get support for that and I don't get any credit for it, and it costs me a lot of time and money. So this whole thing about the research culture, really practically supporting openness, is really critical. So what's happening next? I think there's a few things just to put on your horizon, and I put them as challenges and opportunities. So the first one I would just say is that I do think we need to be really cautious about what's happening within the publisher space at this time. So again, if you're not thinking about this all this time, you might not be aware, but there's a huge amount of publisher consolidation that happens all the time. So for example, publishers are regularly buying up each other. What that has led to is a very small number of players within the market having a huge amount of power. And that's really problematic, because it means that if you want to change any system, you have to really negotiate with people who've really dominated the market in publishing. What that is now leading to is, when we're talking about open access, and you may have had emails from publishers about, for example, the new models that we're seeing, the read and publish models that I mentioned, the publishers basically want to make research open via their journals. They're not interested in experimentation. They want to make sure that whatever happens with openness more generally, it means that you publish in their journals. So they are increasingly trying to shut down, for example, the discussions around having repositories and having sort of experimental models, because they want to see that the money going into their own model. And underpinning all of that is a huge amount of data collection by publishers. So that, we all know this thing about that, nothing's really free on the internet. If you're not paying for it, then you're the product, basically. And that is true for publishers. So every time we access any of these, any product from a publisher, we know that they're collecting our data, and there is some quite concerns that then that may actually be used to influence how researchers are targeted by publishers. The good thing is, I think that we have some opportunities to push back on this. So first of all, we are seeing funders interested in more diverse approaches. In the UKRI is actually putting money into innovation and funding experimental models. And we're seeing that also elsewhere in Europe. We know that UNESCO has really now got open science in its targets. So what we're seeing with the UNESCO recommendation is that they want to monitor progress for countries, and I'm quite looking forward to what's going to happen over the next 4 years, because I do suspect with a lot of these international initiatives that countries just kind of sign up to them and then sort of put them on the back burner. But UNESCO said quite clearly that they will be coming back to the countries in 4 years' time to ask them where they've got to. So every country needs to be thinking about what their open science approach is. And then from the point of view of experimentation, a large amount of that is actually coming from the academic community. So we're seeing some really interesting and innovative approaches that have been led by academics who've seen a particular problem within their own area. So just for example, in physics, there's a thing called SciPost, which was set up by a researcher who decided that the publishing system just simply didn't work for him. So he set up a new approach, and it's actually become a model that has been used quite widely across physics. So we are seeing some really good opportunities. So coming back to this horrendous diagram, which you're more than welcome to have a look at, is actually, I think if you scan the QR code, it should work. I think we've come a hugely long way from the very beginning, where we were just dabbling in repositories, through to right up here when we've got the chief scientist who says we need open access, through to some great work that's being done by the university librarians to actually make sure that we have the way to support openness and to make it easy for researchers to do. We are seeing a huge amount of change. I would just say to all of you that it's very important to have researchers fully engaged in this space. We are seeing increasingly that a lot of this is being driven by publishers, being driven by large organizations. When it's driven by researchers, it goes in a particular way that is often much more innovative and much more equitable. So if you're interested in this, I would really encourage you to get involved with it and make your voice heard, particularly through your national academies. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That was wonderful. So do we have any questions? Yes, please.
Thanks, Jenny. Incredibly important area. One of the challenges with open access journals is the number of predatory journals that have come onto the market. And for researchers, especially early career researchers, where can I publish that's reputable?
Yeah.
Yeah, because some of them is, the review process is just totally inadequate. It's just about the money.
Yeah, no, look, it's a huge issue. And there's, I could give you a whole separate talk on that, more than happy to. The issue I would say is that the thing about these publishers is that they often write to all of, I mean, who's had a letter from a predatory publisher? Everyone has, haven't they? You're probably 3 a day or whatever. It's I always think it's a bit like, if somebody turns up at your door and says, can I have your dog or your firstborn child? I mean, you wouldn't give it to them. I mean, this is kind of the equivalent of doing that, really. So mainly we say to people, be sensible. Think about why would you publish in a journal you've never heard of? If your supervisor's not publishing in it, why would you be considering it? Do you know the editorial board? Have you thought about the processes associated with it? I think to a large extent, this is a kind of, it's an issue of not applying sort of common sense to, the processes that we normally apply in our everyday life. You're absolutely right. They are a scam. But, there are scams in many parts. I don't know, everybody gets millions of emails a day, millions of, text messages a day asking for your information. Just regard it like that and use a lens associated with that. The good thing about the read and publish model that has been negotiated at the moment by the university libraries is that you can now publish in a whole bunch of the journals that previously you couldn't publish in without having to pay a cost associated with it. So just go to your usual journal. I mean, I really would say be extremely cautious when you get these emails. Same is true for conferences. Same is true if you're asked to be an editor of these journals, which is another way that they kind of try and lock you in.
Well, my question goes to quality, because I've been working across both sides of the fence on editorial boards for both Open Access and Elsevier and Springer, right? Yeah. And a worrying trend, especially in the last year and a half, is where either scientific editors or reviewers pick up clear issues. So people will provide their Open Access Western blots, and their 3 repeats are actually 3 different times of exposure of the same blot. And these things are very clearly pointed out, but in these Open Access journals, the publishing editors or managing editors are still letting these papers go out. And so this has been getting worse and worse, to the point where it's really worrying about the quality of science that's going out there. So how do we manage to build the quality that the journals purely focused on the impact and advertising have into an open access system?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that, we actually know that the journals that retract the most papers are the ones who probably are looking more closely at papers. So first off, open access is just a method of distribution. So you're not, just because something is open access doesn't make it lower quality. Some of a couple of the 2 most high profile retractions that happened during the pandemic were in the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. So, and we can go back many years to talk about retractions and terrible papers that have been published in closed access journals. The good thing about open access actually is that, if there is a problem, one particularly great thing about it is if there is a problem, you can see it pretty quickly. The thing about the closed access journals is that, these things have lingered along for many years and nobody will be able to find them. Quality is an issue wherever you publish. The issue is more that the issue I believe right now is that the complexity of the stuff that's being published is not sufficiently managed by the current peer review system. So again, I'm sure all of you get many peer review requests a week. We know that the peer review system is really buckling, and that there isn't sufficient scrutiny of papers pre-publication. Preprints in many ways have been really helpful in that, because if you expose a paper before it gets finally published, you can have a level of peer review before the final version ends up online. I think that what we need to do really is, first off, embed culture and quality right at the institutions. I mean, I used to work as I was the chair of this organisation called the Committee on Publication Ethics, and people often used to say to us, it's the journal's problem with the quality of your research. And I said, it's not just our problem. The problem is with the institutions you sit in, because people don't falsify or make poor quality research just to get into a journal. They do it because it's important for their career, because they have incentive systems that push them to cut corners to try and to get into high impact factor journals. So the whole system is really highly problematic. Again, more than happy to talk about that intersection, but I think what we really need is a critical look at the whole system, and it starts with the quality and the culture of research within an institution, and it feeds all the way through. So I would love to see better scrutiny of research before it even gets to a journal. I think by the time it gets to a journal, there should be no issues with the quality of it. But unfortunately, right now, that is where things are picked up. I'd also like to see a better way of correcting things. Right now, we only have the system of retractions, and a group of us a few years ago proposed a different model for correcting research, which was much closer to the kind of things that you see within newspapers, for example, where you can have easy sort of correction of articles. Right now, the system's incredibly clunky. It's also associated, for example, with with blame, when that often isn't the issue. It's often to do with sloppiness. So we'd like to see a whole rethinking of the system, but it's definitely not just the openness that's the issue. It's across the publishing system.
Thank you. So we have a question on the left
up here,
here,
and I just want to add my concerns as well to Fiona's, because I think that is a major challenge. You've given a great answer to it, but I still don't think the solutions are really there. I just had a point around one. I think the institutions have been trying to get better at this, but I've spent the last couple of months trying to liaise with our librarian liaison to find out about the new publishing deals, and that's it turns out that it's really very few papers, and there's still some controls at the end of the publisher as whether or not they choose that your paper is one of the ones that can have that free deal, and then also trying to find out where I can put a repository, because I've gone through my old publication record and there's still some old papers that aren't open access, and they said, oh, well, you just make sure it goes up onto your researcher ID page, and it says, well, it is there, but it's still not open. Where do I put the paper? So I think there's still problems with the culture and the institutions not actually facilitating us doing this properly.
Yeah.
But
which institute, can I just why which?
Well, UQ, everybody.
UQ, okay, all right, no, well, okay.
Yeah. And then the challenge is that we're already running our research on underfunded budgets, and so again, NH and MRC and ARC can all they want say, we think that this is the policy that it should be, but then we can't even put publication costs in our budget on our grant because it's not a set cost. So again, major cultural challenges with respect to being able to do this properly. And then finally, I just want to also raise a concern as a female or a woman researcher when it comes to open review. I have backlash just from asking questions openly at a conference versus actually openly listing what my reviews of other people's papers. I already have enough barriers to my career advancing as it is. That seems like a really silly, risky thing to do from my perspective, because we again can't control people's viewpoints on your review.
Yeah. So taking the first one, I think that I completely agree about this thing about the cost. This is why we need to not shift from a position where, you can't read, so you can't publish. The NHMRC and ARC, I don't think any time soon are going to put costs in a line item, but I don't think they should do. This is why I'm really excited about the work that the Chief Scientist is doing to try and take a national approach to this. This is why the read and publish agreements should be really good for researchers. I completely agree with you that we haven't quite, and I don't know the system at UQ as well as I know it at QUT. I don't think we've got it quite right yet in explaining that to researchers, but it should be possible now to bundle in the publication costs within the overall amount of money that we pay to libraries, to publishers. So it should not be borne by you. So I would encourage you to continue to engage with your library, because they will be able to help with this, and I think we're going to get better with it. We have to move to a system where the costs of publishing are part of the whole infrastructure. I absolutely feel that very strongly. Even when I worked at PLOS, we thought that the world was going to work through an article processing charge model. I don't think that is the case now, and increasing that globally, I think that's where we're seeing. But also the repositories have a really important role in that. And with regard to the open peer review, look, I understand that, and I'm relatively kind of established. I don't have to worry about it. I do hear that. I do think that there should be the opportunity to make stuff open. It shouldn't be kind of an obligatory one, but I think that generally speaking, what people find when they actually study open peer review is that it's more constructive, it's less kind of challenging than closed peer review. But I completely hear you about the mean that it might not be good for it. Okay, fair enough. I would love us to see a change in the culture where that isn't the case, but I take your point. Yeah.
Okay, with the microphone.
So could you speak up a bit?
Hold on, it is on now. Thank you for your talk. It's really good. I just wanted to kind of ask about the research framework and recommendation that you were involved in, the 5-day big long meeting, because as an ECR, when this information filters down for us, a lot of the wording around open access and open data is open for interpretation by individual researchers. So to me, open access and open data would be every single data point, every single FCS file, every single imaging pixel I generate is open for scrutiny with my publications. So they go on a repository if it's possible. On the other hand, if I'm feeling moody or if I'm a researcher who doesn't want to do that, a simple line in my publication which says data will be available on request is suffice to say I've done my open data, open access part. And this comes to a paper that was published 2 weeks ago in Clinical Epidemiology, which showed that 93% of researchers were either unable or unwilling to provide their data, which said, available on request. So in your framework and recommendation, is there a clear guideline and wording that basically says, no, this is what you're supposed to do? You can't just write a line and say, I've done my bit as part of the problem.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the kind of thing that they want, that needs to be properly resourced. I mean, there was a paper that came out of the EU about 5 years ago that started to put a cost to the amount of money that needs to go in to make research data fully open, and it's huge. It's really quite a substantial extra cost, and not only the cost of financial cost of doing it, having repositories that are sort of well curated and such like, but having individuals that have the skills to do this, and not just at the individual researcher level, but having it within the institution. So we do not have the infrastructure to do that at the moment. There's no doubt about that. And that paper is a very depressing one. It's exactly the same as one that was done about 5 years ago that said that if you ask most people for their data, they can't provide it, or they say they can provide it, and then actually that just isn't the case. So there clearly needs to be a good conversation about what research data infrastructure we need. So the Australian Research Data Commons is doing some of that work. There's also some work that's been led out of the Australian Academy of Science, and on having a proper data infrastructure. We're quite a long way away from that yet. And so for some specialties, it will be appropriate to make every data point available. That's currently what that's what CERN does at the moment, for example. For medical research, that won't be appropriate. We have to develop it for each individual each individual institution. I'm actually talking about something later on this week where we're going to be saying, well, there is also this problem with some open data that it can be weaponized against so that's been classically the case for the climate data. We know that a lot of that research is taken and misinterpreted. So I think we need a really sophisticated conversation about what open data really means and put the infrastructure in place, because we're definitely not there yet.
Hello, it's working. Okay, great. On the topic of, by the way, debate on open access, there's a really good online debate system called Kialo. Don't know if it ever got funding, but it forces you to engage with the debate rather than the person, which is really nice. But my question was actually more about kind of negative results and the impact that you think open access might have on publishing of negative results, because I imagine that, publications benefit from these, amazing, wow, impressive results. And I was just wondering if you could comment on what you think will happen with, the problem with negative results not being published with an increasingly open access kind of situation.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that, another world that I'm very interested in is research assessment. I mean, the impact factor is a truly appalling measure of quality. It's an appalling measure of a journal's quality, doesn't measure an individual article's policy, and it definitely doesn't measure the worth of research. And that might be a, kind of something you don't necessarily want to hear, but it is actually, and it's weaponized all the time by publishers to encourage submissions to their journals. And it's a highly, highly problematic issue. I'd be really interested to see what the impact factors of the journals are after the pandemic, because they're going to be about 1 million. I mean, I don't know what they'll be, but they will be insane. And it will be whichever journal managed to get that first genome. Was that the NEGM? I can't remember. I think it was the NEGM. So that will have an impact factor of about 1 million. So has the NEGM got 1 million times better in the last couple of years? I don't think so. So there's huge problems with how we assess research at the moment. And it's because it's based on sort of metrics that really are not appropriate. So this whole thing about negative results is really interesting. So who's published in PLOS One here? Yeah. So PLOS One was one of the journals that we set up at PLOS, and the exact idea of PLOS One was to publish sound research that wasn't necessarily high impact. That was the whole idea behind it. And it was hugely successfsul. We actually, when we first started it, we thought that maybe we'll get a few papers a week or something like that. We opened the doors and the papers just flooded in because there was a massive, massive need for it. The problem is, to succeed within the publishing system at that time, you had to have an impact factor, even for a journal like that. Now, we didn't seek one, but journal was assigned one. And that was the thing that then people said, well, once you've got an impact factor, we can submit to you, because if you don't have an impact factor, we can't get measured on it, and the whole thing is a really, kind of vicious cycle. So yes, open access, because it doesn't rely on, selling subscriptions to research, should be the answer to that kind of thing. But the problem is it's tied up with a incentive system that only rewards high impact research, whatever that means. So I would love us to see us having that conversation much more carefully. And again, that is a thing that needs to happen within an institution. So instead of rewarding people just for publishing in a high impact factor journal, you give them credit if they do sound research, if they publish a paper that's a reproduction of another one, if they publish their data, that kind of thing. So it should be as part of it, but we're not quite there yet.
Two more, if you can make them brief. Nicholas first.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to say briefly, there's two sides of the coin with regards to preprint. And I turned from a skeptic to a fan of preprint. However, you still, and we need people like you who tell actually people what a preprint is, and there's still quite a lot of confusion out there. So I keep hearing that from colleagues that they don't know that they can cite preprints. And the whole point that you made is that we can mark our territory and say we are not going to be scooped because we are first, but if people don't understand it, it's not the case. Yeah. And so this is an important point. So we need better communication to what a preprint is.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And there's also, we need better, I think we need better education overall of terminology overall. This is one of the things about the preprint, the citation of it. This is why I got very anxious when, there's one particular, when people say, well, we'll publish a preprint, but we won't give it a DOI. Well, what's the point of that? Literally, there is no point in doing that. That paper will disappear, once the URL breaks, which, will probably be in about 2 years' time, because that's what happens with URLs. So it's really problematic for that. And I think this whole idea of also just educating people so they know what it is. One of the problems about the research literature at the moment is people think that a final published article is the final word in whatever that research area is, and we all know that isn't the case. Preprints should be regarded as people need to educate generally researchers, journalists, the public on where a preprint sits within the kind of the peer review system, I think. And we're seeing that increasingly. If you look at a lot of preprints who are cited on by journalists now, they'll say actually this isn't a peer reviewed piece of research, and that's great. That's exactly what you want.
Okay, last question.
Data only lasts as long as the servers that it's stored on. and the organizations that protect those
Sorry, I
servers.
can't hear you.
Sorry. So data only lasts as long as the servers that they're hosted on and the organizations that protect those servers and ensure that access is available to those servers. So my question is about orphaned open access. What happens when a country restricts access to its servers, prevents access to open access repositories, funding is removed, and the open access repository is orphaned, and the data that's on there, the works that are on there is orphaned? Have you encountered that much? Has that been something that's happening? You know, what's the international perspective on that? Yeah,
there's the whole world of kind of thinking about the preservation of research, and it's a really, really important one. The advantage of open access, if it's properly licensed and such like, is you do actually ensure that you can have multiple copies. So one of the great things we always used to say about PLOS, for example, is that if we went bankrupt overnight, it didn't actually matter, because all the papers would be in PubMed Central, they'd be on people's, you know, you'd be able to get them, that they're not just locked in one place. A much bigger problem actually is proprietary papers that are only held by publishers. They can close theirs down overnight, as I showed. And if those journals go bankrupt and they haven't properly archived them, they're lost. And that happens, you know, we know that happens quite consistently. So this comes back to this issue about the infrastructure that's needed to support them. You absolutely need long-term preservation that is well documented, and there's a lot of work going on to do that, but we're definitely not there yet for all of it.
Thank you very much, Ginny, and thank you to all the questions. I think that was a really terrific discussion there. And if you're online and you wanted to ask some, the trick next time is come down to the auditorium, guys. So let's thank Ginny. I think that was a really terrific discussion and talk you gave us. Thank you.